Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Richard Fleming, and today is Sunday, the 24th of January, 2021. In today's video, I want to walk you through pieces of information that I think that you need to be aware of regarding the currently available vaccines, both in the United States and other countries, and look at some of the terms that are used and the actual information that we have about these vaccines. And to do that, I'm going to share my screen with you and walk you through information that I believe you need to be aware of, as well as our legislators, both in state and national, as well as the attorneys generals of the specific states, as they look to determine their role in SARS-CoV-2 treatments, vaccinations, and consideration of investigation and prosecution of those that have been involved in the development and dissemination of both this virus and the vaccines. The CDC website, as of the 15th of December, 2020, specifically stated that there was not enough information available for the CDC to make recommendations to individuals regarding the spread and distribution of the virus, as well as what the vaccines are able to do. On the 15th of December, 2020, last month, approximately 5 weeks ago, the CDC stated that there are currently no available vaccines that will prevent COVID-19. However, if you look at the CDC website today and you look under the area of immunizations and they discuss the basics, they want to make certain that the general public understands several basic terms. And I too would like you to understand those terms. Immunity is protection from a disease, from an infectious disease. That is their definition. Now, that protection means that you will make T cells and antibodies to a vaccine or to naturally acquiring the virus. It doesn't mean you won't get infected. It simply means that you have the T cell for the T cell cytotoxic response to attack and swallow or eat, or what's called phagocytize the virus, or antibodies from the B cells. A vaccine, by definition of the CDC, is a product that stimulates this immune response. Now, there's considerable discussion about whether these vaccines should be called vaccines, as they're currently called, or whether we should consider them a gene therapy, because in fact, what is being done is to introduce the genes of these viruses into your very cells so that your cells will make more of the virus. A point I want to get to in just a moment, where I do not believe that we're being told honestly and upfront all of the genetic material in these viruses for reasons that you'll understand in just a moment. Vaccination is considered the introduction of a vaccine into your body to produce this immunologic response. The website has gone from stating that there's no vaccine available to protect against the infection to simply now stating that the COVID-19 vaccine, although it doesn't state which one would presume either of the two, helps protect you from getting COVID-19. It doesn't prevent you from getting the virus. The vaccines or the gene therapy, depending upon how you want to look at it, encourage your body to develop T cell and antibody responses in preparation for becoming infected. And if it doesn't prevent you from becoming infected, then it doesn't protect you. The medical definition of infection is the invasion or multiplication of microorganisms such as bacteria and viruses. This is essentially what is called the vaccines or gene therapy do. They take a component of the virus, the mRNA, reportedly of the spike protein, and wrap it in a lipid coat. Now, instead of the virus having to be dependent upon ACE receptors on your cells, of which there's a limited number, a significantly more substantial number of mRNA for the spike protein can get into the cells than ever before, because this lipid layer will merely merge with your cells and dump all this mRNA into the cells for you to make viral proteins, spike viral proteins, which will then be presented to the outside of your cells using something called the major histocompatibility complex, MHC, if you hear that term again, so that your body's immune system will respond to it, and in this case, develop a T cell response and potentially then an antibody response. So why did I raise the question earlier about whether we're getting all the information about the total amount of mRNA being put into the cells by these vaccines? Well, it's very simple. In this book, which admittedly I'm the author of, called Unmasking COVID, this is in part 1, you'll see the entire mRNA of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. This latter part is the mRNA for structural proteins, and if you look here, this is the mRNA for the spike protein, the notorious spike protein. And this is the mRNA that the vaccine manufacturers state that they have in their vaccines. However, this mRNA doesn't magically get turned into the protein called the spike glycoprotein. It requires instructions. And those instructions come from this part of the mRNA. This part, the replicase, to replicate or to make more of. These proteins here are needed so that this spike protein can be made. So if this was the only part of the mRNA being given to somebody, this little green bar, there'd be no instructions in what they're giving you in the vaccines to make these proteins, these protease and transcriptase proteins, to make the spike protein. For that reason, I'm skeptical about what is actually being provided to people, because simply giving the spike protein by itself won't tell your cells to make the spike protein. You have to have instructions. And that suggests that something else is in the vaccines that they're not being completely honest about. Now, a lot of people are aware that this vaccine is now being given throughout the country and throughout the world, both vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna, through an emergency use authorization. So in the United States, it's called an FDA emergency use authorization, which can only be given if there is no other treatment available. And if you watch some of my other videos, you'll see that we talk about evidence of treatments that are available that should be considered by your physician, and each state, its public health department, should take that up in its own way to address the treatment being provided to patients. But let's look at these vaccines and what really was filed with the FDA. I'm going to walk you through the emergency use authorization document for Pfizer, and you'll be glad to know that we will not read all 53 pages of this. But I have gone to the effort of highlighting a couple areas in yellow to bring to your attention specific questions about the safety and the efficacy of these vaccines. As we walk through here, I'm simply going to scroll down until we get to the applicable highlighted areas that I've done in advance for you. The executive summary that was issued here by the corporation, by Pfizer, for its BioNTech, the sponsor, was that the proposed use of an emergency use authorization was for active immunization for the prevention of COVID-19. Now, immunization does not prevent you from getting the infection. Immunization is so that your body has already seen part of the virus, developed a T cell and antibody response, so that when you get exposed to the virus in real time, in the real world, your body can recognize it sooner and react faster. That's what immunity is about. It's not about preventing anything. No vaccine prevents anything. They go on to state that in the event an emergency use authorization is issued for this product, the Pfizer vaccine, it would still be considered unapproved and it would be under further investigation. Unapproved, further investigation. As we continue to scroll down, there's a lot of material that you can feel free to read on your own if you're interested in doing it. A lot of discussion about all the potential side effects that could occur. In fact, a great deal of emphasis placed on the issue of side effects, which I think you're going to be very interested in knowing that the instance of side effects is more prevalent than most people are aware. All the different side effects and consequences that we're seeing. But how did they determine efficacy, if it worked? They didn't do it by the T cell or antibody response. The end definition of whether the vaccine was effective was whether a PCR response occurred showing the virus, the antigen, to be present. This is the nasal swab and the oral swab. The presence of a positive PCR test tells you you have virus particles or portions of the virus in your nose or in your mouth where they swab it. It doesn't tell you that that virus is alive. It doesn't tell you that it's going to cause more of a problem. And it doesn't tell you whether you're going to need treatment or hospitalization for more treatment. It merely tells you part of the genome, the genetic material of the virus is there. So using that with all of the potential errors and misinterpretations of this on-off light switch, yes, no, we see virus particles or not, is not a very discrete way of determining anything. It does tell you there's virus particles present, but it doesn't tell you if you have an effective T cell or B cell response as a result of the vaccine. More information about outcomes and consequences. This curve is the same thing that they like to use, looking at people that have developed COVID-19, the disease, with, by definition, a PCR positive test. These are the folks that didn't get the vaccine test, and the blue ones are the ones that did. That looks like a substantial difference until you realize that the presence of a positive PCR test doesn't mean you're going to get the disease. It merely means you have the virus. And you're going to get the virus whether you are vaccinated or not It's how you respond to the virus. And many people don't require any hospitalization or any treatment of any sort to get over the virus, just like many viruses. Your normal immune system kicks in on its own, and you don't get the disease, the bad state, where all the hospitalization and treatment is required. If you continue to scroll down, and we get through more and more symptoms, basically they're admitting symptoms occur. Okay. And we will share a little bit with you later about where you can go look for more information on these actual symptoms. But as you go through here, severe adverse effects, suspected COVID-19 cases. Now we're getting to some of the meat and potatoes about what all of this means from the Pfizer research presentation for the emergency use authorization. As specified in the protocol, suspected cases of symptomatic COVID-19 were not PCR confirmed. People got the disease without a positive PCR, and people with a positive PCR didn't get the disease. As specified in the protocol, suspected cases of symptomatic COVID-19 that were not PCR confirmed were not recorded as adverse events unless they met regulatory criteria for seriousness. So if they didn't find PCR, they kind of fell through the system. They didn't quite know what to do with it. What do we know about pregnant women with this vaccine? A positive test resulted in exclusion or discontinuation from the study. In other words, they didn't really study pregnant women or breastfeeding women in this study. Although there were some women, 23 of whom actually got some of the, at least the first round of the vaccine, and there were unsolicited adverse events related to these pregnant women, including spontaneous abortions and retained products of conception, which is a dead fetus. Pregnancy outcomes otherwise are unknown at this time. Some of the blood tests that were done looked at the actual white blood cells that you use to fight off infections. And one of the interesting findings from the blood tests that were obtained is that the lymphocytes, which are important for fighting off viruses, actually showed a temporary decrease or drop following the administration of the vaccine. And that drop increased with the second dose, although it was transient because they only followed them for so long. FYI, some of you may notice that Pfizer has two different vaccines. The one that ends with the B2 is where they claim that the mRNA is the full length of the spike protein. And the B1 is where it was only the top part, the regional binding domain of the spike protein. That's the difference between those two vaccines. What we want to do is get down here to the gaps in the data. Duration of protection. It is not possible to assess sustained efficacy over a period longer than 2 months. Efficacy in the high-risk group, people with HIV, AIDS, or other immune disorders, was too small to evaluate efficacy. Efficacy in individuals previously infected. The data are insufficient to make conclusions about a benefit in individuals with prior SARS-CoV-2 infection. A lot of people ask, we've had an infection, should we get vaccinated? Well, the answer is, again, there's insufficient data to say what the outcome is. Effectiveness in pediatrics, there's no efficacy data available for people 15 or younger. And in at least one individual from 16 to 17 years of age, there was a confirmed COVID case following receiving the vaccine. Future effectiveness for a pandemic? Well, if there's mutations in the S protein, the conclusion was there's limited information to provide regarding the efficacy outcomes of this vaccine for mutations in the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Effectiveness against asymptomatic, data are limited. Detection of the virus and data are limited to assess the effect of the vaccine against asymptomatic infection measured by the detection of the virus and or detection of antibodies. Effectiveness for long-term sequelae, not possible to assess whether the vaccine will have an impact on specific long-term sequelae in individuals who are infected despite vaccination. Mortality, will it keep you alive? A larger number of individuals are needed to confirm any efficacy of the vaccine against mortality. Effectiveness against transmission. The only way you can transmit the virus is if you have the virus, which means that if you've been vaccinated and you get infected, well, your symptoms may be less, but you still got infected, and you would have to be infected to be able to transmit the virus to someone else. What do we know? The data are limited to assess the effect of the vaccine against transmission of SARS-CoV-2 from individuals who are infected despite vaccination. Additional evaluations, including data from clinical trials and from vaccine use post-authorization, will be needed to assess the effect of the vaccine in preventing virus shedding, transmission, particularly in asymptomatic infection. We might as well get to this information right now. On the 18th of this month, just 6 days ago, I posted a video looking at the emergency use authorizations and a shorter version of this. But based upon all the questions that I'm getting from people, I thought it was important to give you more information, to show you more detail, which is what I'm doing today. On the 18th of January, both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines said that they were in active trial recruiting patients on the 18th of January. On the 20th of January, Pfizer filed documentation that they were no longer actively recruiting. It took 2 days, and then the national clinical trials run by NIH updated the posting on the 22nd of January. So, on the 20th of January, on Inauguration Day, whether there's a connection or not, I don't know. But on the 20th of January, Pfizer filed that while its clinical research studies were active, they were no longer recruiting. And you can scroll down to the bottom of these things, looking at what their the focus is, and you can find a history of the changes. And you will see that it was the 20th of January that they changed the recruitment status to an inactive status. Pfizer wasn't the only one. This is the Moderna. And you can see here that they filed, and theirs was posted on the 20th of January, where they are not actively recruiting. They're active, but they're not recruiting anybody anymore. So I'm not quite certain how they're going to come up with this additional information. Other than the fact that they are vaccinating large numbers of Americans at this time under an emergency use authorization using these vaccines. Safety in certain populations, yeah. Insufficient data for people under 16 years old. Vaccine-enhanced disease. Available data do not indicate a risk of vaccine-enhanced disease. Well, this was published on the 10th of December. On the 18th of December, the Osaka, Japan physicians published their paper showing that there are, in fact, enhanced antibodies increasing the infectivity to the SARS virus. So there are vaccine-enhanced disease, looking at the Osaka data. And I've probably shown this to you before, but these physicians found that some antibodies against what's called the N-terminal domain, it's a part of the spike protein, dramatically enhanced the binding of the spike protein to the ACE2 receptor and thus increased the infectivity of SARS-CoV-2. This has been seen, by the way, in 3 out of 48 uninfected donors. So people who simply gave blood and weren't thought to be infected, they found in 3 of the 48 antibodies to this N-terminal domain, which increases the infectivity of the virus. It should be considered an exacerbating factor, and that a spike protein lacking such antibody epitopes may be required for a safe vaccine. So in other words, they said to develop a safe vaccine, you would need to exclude the N-terminal domain of the spike protein, or you will increase the risk of developing antibodies to it and increasing the infectivity. Well, gosh, I don't think we're going to see anybody go back and modify any of these documents with the additional proof showing that there is a concern and now data to show vaccine-enhanced disease. As we get to the end, most of the information of the results talk about evidence of specific T cell responses to CD4 and CD8, T cell responses. More of a Th1 phenomenon, which is a shift towards the T cell response and away from the actual antibody response. Now, that's the Pfizer emergency use authorization document that the FDA used to clear emergency use authorization. Here's what Pfizer wants you to know, because this is the document for recipients, that's you, and caregivers, us. The Pfizer BioNTech vaccine may prevent you. There is no US Food and Drug Administration FDA-approved vaccine to prevent COVID. Vaccine may not protect everyone. It may prevent things. It may protect. It's an unapproved vaccine. There is no FDA-approved vaccine to prevent COVID-19. So no matter what somebody else tells you, these people are admitting there is no FDA-approved vaccine. It's unapproved. It's not been shown to prevent COVID-19. Vaccines don't prevent disease. What are the benefits? It's an ongoing clinical trial, which now, according to what I just showed you, they're no longer recruiting subjects for as of the 20th of January. Vaccine has been shown to prevent following 2 doses. Duration is unknown. It doesn't prevent. It produces, if anything, an immune response, duration of which is unknown. It has not been shown to prevent disease. And there's no measured T cell levels or antibody titers. In fact, the antibody results that are shown in the publications in the medical literatures are averaged results. They're not the actual measured titer results. They're geometric means, modifying the data so that they can play and manipulate it with it. But you're not seeing measured titers, actual titers showing up, and you're not getting measured T cell responses. They're looking at other markers that infer something might be going on. And hopefully there is some benefit, but you have to prove it. You don't get a free pass, particularly with more than 400,000 dead Americans. Currently, there is no approved alternative vaccine. Well, that was good for Pfizer. Wait till you get to Moderna's. There is no information on other vaccines. Yeah, December 2020. When did they publish it is the cute comment. The vaccine has not undergone the same type of review as an FDA approved or cleared product, which is interesting because in 2017 and 2018, the FDA pulled twice as many drugs off the market than it approved. Drugs that it had already approved as being safe and effective that were brought to its attention weren't safe and effective. Let's take a look at the Moderna vaccine emergency use authorization. You'll be happy to know this one's a little shorter. I believe the other one was, well, it's about the same number of pages, actually. My apologies. It just seemed shorter when I read through it. So here's the Moderna vaccine. Skip through that because we'll get over here to where I've highlighted things in yellow for you. Again, you're more than welcome to go read all of this for yourself. It's for scientists, not so bad. For the general public, I'm not certain it's very helpful, but we'll get to a general public one. Proposed use of the Moderna emergency use authorization, prevention of COVID-19 in 18 years or older. A negative PCR doesn't mean that you've prevented an infection, and a positive PCR doesn't mean you're going to have a disease. Using PCR as the determinant for these vaccines to determine whether they were effective is not an accurate measure of effectiveness. And the efficacy will be discussed later, also shows insufficient data. And we'll plow through this document, leaving it available for you to go pull it up under Moderna EUA documents, just like you can go look for the Pfizer EUA documents for the FDA. They're online. You can download these very documents yourself, and I encourage you to do so. You can see a lot of information is placed on what are the side effects. Clearly, there are side effects. Okay. If you spend a lot of time on side effects, you don't spend very much time on whether it's effective or not. Same issue as before, with PCR being used to determine whether the people get disease. Disease is not just PCR. Disease is PCR plus lots of clinician. Safety, FDA has not independently verified the complete safety data set and analysis. I believe there was something like this on the Pfizer one as I look back on it. The FDA, in granting the emergency use authorization, wants you to know that it didn't independently validate or verify the data from Pfizer or Moderna. They took their word for it. As we continue to scroll down here, and it locked up, I think. There we go. Even the computers thinks this is long. Lots of things about adverse effects. Very little information in these about actual efficacy. And most of it is we don't have enough information about efficacy, but we want you to think they're effective. Sponsors plans for continued blinded placebo. Well, what they're saying here for Moderna is that if you were in the placebo group and you later then want to go ahead and get the Moderna vaccine, rather than watching to see whether you as a member in a placebo group end up with the virus, not the disease, just the virus, they're going to go ahead and vaccinate you with the Moderna. So they lose a control group. They have no idea, will have no idea what really happens in society. Known benefits. Second dose, highly effective in preventing. In other words, a test that does not define the extent of disease. Using PCR as the criteria for saying the vaccine is effective is not a good criteria, because the PCR test doesn't tell you whether the virus is already dead, whether it's going to be a problem and you're going to become symptomatic and ill having the disease or not. PCR equals presence of the virus. It does not equal presence of disease. This is coronavirus disease. They're checking for the presence of the coronavirus versus the disease and merging the two, hoping you won't understand the distinction. It's not possible for them to assess any sustained efficacy. And in fact, if as we read through this, you'll see they're not really able to make claims of efficacy, but their limitation here is 2 months. Efficacy outcomes, high-risk groups, again, like Pfizer, too small to evaluate. Effectiveness in people infected. Study was not designed to assess the benefit in people who were infected. Effectiveness in pediatrics, no data, 17 years or younger. Future effectiveness, again, with mutations in the S protein, it's impossible for them to make conclusions. Effectiveness against asymptomatic, the data is limited. It's limited. Effectiveness against long-term sequelae, not possible to determine or assess, including in symptomatic and asymptomatic individuals. Effectiveness against mortality, they can't tell, not enough people. Effectiveness against transmitting, the same issue before. You can't transmit the virus to someone else unless you have the virus. So getting the vaccine, infected despite vaccination, doesn't prevent you from transmitting it. Hence, continue wearing masks and social distance, because there's no evidence to suggest that vaccinating people means they won't get infected, won't have the virus, and won't spread it. It may shorten the amount of time you feel ill, but decreasing symptoms is what Motrin and Advil and Tylenol do. This is a very expensive way to shorten the duration or significance of symptoms, and it hasn't been shown to be effective to do anything else by their own admission. Safety, data gaps, insufficient data if you're less than 18, pregnant, lactating, or immune compromised. Adverse reactions, fairly uncommon, they say, but we're going to require more information for potentially serious side effects. Available data on vaccine-enhanced disease, you saw it before. The Osaka paper shows that antibodies to the N-terminal domain of the spike protein increases the infectivity. They got this one cleared on the 17th of December, one day before the Osaka paper came out. Study design has been looking at healthy individuals 18 years of older. Statistical analysis, no formal statistical hypothesis. It's descriptive. We see responses. We average a bunch of things, but it's not descriptive, or it's not measured, quantified. It's descriptive. So they can't statistically say diddly squat. But they have a vaccine now with emergency use authorization. And what does Moderna want you, the recipients, and us, the caregivers, to know? May prevent you. There is no U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved vaccine to prevent COVID-19. Despite what Pfizer may have suggested, there is no U.S. FDA approved vaccine to prevent COVID-19. Vaccine may not protect everyone, may or may not. There's no approved vaccine. There's no unapproved vaccine. It is an unapproved vaccine. What are the benefits? They're stating again, been shown to prevent. It doesn't prevent for the same reason we talked about with Pfizer. using a PCR test doesn't tell you whether the virus is actually present. When it is positive, it tells you the virus is present, but it doesn't tell you whether you're going to get the disease. And let's see. Like Pfizer, the Moderna COVID vaccine has not undergone the same type of review as an FDA-approved or cleared product. With the same caveat I did before, the FDA has been pulling twice as many drugs off the shelf as it's been adding to the shelf, which isn't the greatest, support that you're doing a great job if you have to pull twice as many drugs off the market that you've already approved as you're currently approving. All right. That information provided. There is a website that, as of the 15th of January, had the following listing. As of the 15th of January, the VAERS, which is the adverse effect website, currently shows 181 people died following the vaccine. You should look at this group. These deaths occur in people from 44 on up. More older individuals, as you've heard, but not an insignificant number of deaths in people between in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. Those are the dead people. Also on the 15th of January, from the same VAERS data site, there have been 7,844 cases of adverse effects in the United States following the vaccines. This is both Pfizer and Moderna. And you can see here something that should trouble you. This group here, this 85% of the people with adverse reactions are between 17 and 65 years of age. End result is that the CDC has said that these vaccines are protective, that they will decrease the harm to individuals. What was the term that they had here? The term was protect. That these vaccines would protect you. Protection requires proof of efficacy. The documents used by the FDA to grant emergency use authorization of these vaccines did not show efficacy. They did not provide measured actual outcomes of antibody titers or T cell measurements. They provided descriptive terms. They used PCR to determine the success of preventing infection, when PCR tells you whether you've been infected. But they also used it to define disease prevention. Disease prevention is not the presence of the virus, but the presence of the disease, the breathing difficulty, the inflammation, the blood clotting that's caused by this virus infecting people and an overwhelmed immunologic response to the virus. There is a world of difference between having a positive PCR test and having COVID coronavirus disease 2019, even if it's in the year 2021. Therefore, the very documents that the FDA used, that they admittedly didn't even check the data on, for these vaccines may have authorized experimental, as the companies admit, these are experimental vaccines. Randomized, sequential, the goal they want. But these are experimental vaccines. Let me check and see here. I thought I found the word here where they admitted it was experimental. It's in here. And I encourage you to go take a look at these things with placebos and investigate on your own these particular vaccines. Sorry about that. Like everybody, I thought I was sharing the screen when I wasn't. The vaccines are experimental. They have not undergone full FDA approval. They are under emergency use authorization. They do not prevent you from getting infected. They do not prevent you from transmitting the virus. They do not prevent you from getting the disease. They may reduce the number of people who get the disease. They may reduce the symptoms, but they do not prevent infection, and they do not provide the type of protection that you're being led to believe that they do. It's my hope that we actually use the drugs that are available for physicians to use to treat SARS-CoV-2 infections and disease to minimize the harm and the deaths resulting from this virus. It would be my hope that we would come up with actual vaccines that would provide actual protection. But the current vaccines don't do that. They are still experimental. And at this point in time, based upon what has been posted on the national clinical trials, these companies are no longer recruiting patients for the studies. Where the information will come from at this point in time will undoubtedly be the people that are vaccinated, which means that the US population has been enrolled as somewhat unwilling participants. I guess you're willing because you're going out there to get vaccinated, but like it or not, you are participating in a research study for their vaccines. And the argument that these aren't vaccines, but actually gene modifying treatments is a valid argument, because let's remember, mRNA has been investigated for the better part of a decade or two in efforts to treat cancer. The goal is to take the mRNA that's inside of the products and insert them into cancer cells to kill off the cancer cells. And the FDA has not approved a single one of those drugs so far. But for this SARS-CoV-2, we already have 2 under emergency use authorization. This is Dr. Richard Fleming. Today is the 24th of January, 2021. My hope is that this explanation and review of the emergency use authorization documents, as well as the documents that Pfizer and Moderna have made available to patients and physicians, has gone a long way to helping to educate you on what we know that the vaccines do and do not do. I believe that informed consent should be required of patients receiving these vaccines, establishing the lack of evidence of efficacy and the potential consequences with the adverse events and the potential for death. This is looking an awful lot like the swine flu vaccine of the 1970s, where the government rushed forward to provide a vaccine and produced serious neurologic and neuromuscular disease in individuals. This one is showing the same types of consequences and health effects, along with deaths and other organ problems. Again, this is Dr. Richard Fleming. Today is Sunday, the 24th of January, 2021. Stay safe.